may as well start in time, so we set a precedent for the entire academic year. Welcome everybody. This is the PISA opening lecture for the academic year. It's a great honor to welcome you and to present such an exceptional speaker. Before I do that, let me in fact welcome all the new students to our PISA program. For all of you who don't know this, but particularly for the people who are watching us from afar, the PISA program is an interdisciplinary program entirely taught in English, offered by Ca' Foscari University of Venice, and this is in its second year, and we have had like a record number of applications this year. So if anything else, you should be happy about being here if you're PISA students, because you did have to go through quite a rigorous selection process. Today, to open the academic year, we have an exceptional guest who joins us all the way from California. Professor Fred Lawson is head of department and professor of government at Mills College in California, and one of the foremost scholars in terms of international relations of the Middle East. He's the author of various books on Syria, Why Syria Goes to War, or Security Watch Syria, Syria Demystified, which he edited. And in fact, he also a past president of the Syrian Studies Association. So as a coordinator of the PISA program, it is a real honor for me to welcome him at Ca' Foscari. I know that it's not his first time here, but it is the first time that he talks to the PISA students, so please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to experiment with a little bit of technology here, so you can bear with me, please, if things go a little bit wrong. Let's see if I can start the film. Syria's brutal civil war is now 6.5 years old. From 10,000 meters up, it looks as if the fighting has ground to a stubborn stalemate. The Syrian government controls the capital of Damascus and controls the coastal area of Latakia and Tartus. Kurdish forces dominate the high plains of northeastern Syria, and the Islamic State, that's labeled in gray on this map, the Islamic State is entrenched in Raqqa and the towns along the Euphrates River. The basic outlines of that arrangement have been in place since at least the summer of 2013. If we drop down to tree level, however, there are 4 distinct theaters of battle in today's Syria. The first theater consists of the rugged hill country west of Aleppo and north of Hama. In this hill country, government troops have engaged in a fierce battle against a collection of Islamist militants over the last year. One of these militants is the Assistance Front, which the New York Times insists on calling Jabhat al-Nusra, by its Arabic name for some reason. The Assistance Front is the Syrian branch of the Al-Qaeda global Islamist movement and was the original radical Islamist movement in Syria. The Assistance Front carried out a series of suicide bombings in the winter of 2011-2012 and pushed the civil war in a much more violent, much more militant direction. But also in the northwest, along with the Assistance Front, is a powerful group called the Battalions of the Free. The Battalions of the Free of Syria are one of the local armed formations that has played a crucial part in the northwest and has focused not so much on the global Muslim community, but has focused on changing the government inside Syria itself. Also in the northwest, the Hawks of Syria have played a crucial part in fighting against the government. The Hawks of Syria have merged with the Battalions of the Free to form the Army of Conquest. And the Army of Conquest is a powerful group in the northwest. The Army of Conquest expelled the Islamic State from this part of the country in the spring of 2015, and the Army of Conquest, I'm going to stop for a second, and the Army of Conquest threw the Islamic State out of the northwest part of the country and seized control of the provincial capital of Idlib and set up an Islamic emirate in that part of the country in the spring of 2015. The Islamic emirate in Idlib is largely run by the Assistance Front and is set up as a kind of rival organization to the Islamic State's caliphate based in Raqqa in the middle of the country. As soon as the Army of Conquest took over Idlib and other parts of the northwest, the Army of Conquest moved in the direction of the coast, moved in the direction of the parts of the country where the Alawi community and the heartland of backers of the regime is located. The second theater of the Syrian civil war today consists of the sprawling northern city of Aleppo. In the northern city of Aleppo, fighting has raged between government troops and an assortment of Islamist militants. The Army of Conquest has been active around Aleppo, and the Army of Conquest has jockeyed with a rival Islamist group called the Levant Front. So the Assistance Front has faced a powerful competitor around Aleppo, has not been able to dominate the fighting around Aleppo the way that the Assistance Front has dominated the fighting in the northwest. At the same time, the Assistance Front has battled a local formation of the Free Syrian Army for control of the town of Azaz. And the Assistance Front has been fighting against the Northern Storm Brigade for control of this important border town that controls one of the border crossings into Turkey. The Islamic State has been active in this theater of the civil war as well. In April of 2015, the Islamic State moved into one of the crossroads town and fought a battle against the Army of Conquest, and there were reports that Islamic State used chemical weapons in the fighting against the Assistance Front for control of this part of the battlefield. The fighting between the Assistance Front and the Islamic State has enabled government troops to win back territory in the area around Aleppo. And the government has made a push not only around Aleppo itself, but government forces have also made a push north of the city of Aleppo to regain strategic territory in this theater of the civil war. Am I going too fast for the control change? The third important theater of the civil war currently is located in the high plains of the northeast part of the country. I'm talking too fast above the map. In the northeastern part of the country, along the border with Iraq and Turkey, is where Syria's Kurdish community is concentrated. And up in the northeast, the Kurdish community has organized an autonomous zone run by the Democratic Union Party. The Democratic Union Party is now in control of a large part of northeastern Syria. The Democratic Union Party has an armed militia called the Popular Protection Units. The Popular Protection Units are the militia of the Kurds up in the northeast. And the Popular Protection Units have gradually pushed the Islamic State out of northeastern Syria and has pushed in the direction of Tel Tamf and in the direction of Tel Abyad. You may remember that in January of 2015, the Popular Protection Units fought against Islamic State for control of the town of Ain al-Arab and succeeded in stopping the Islamic State from taking control of Ain al-Arab. After the Popular Protection Units stopped Islamic State from taking that town, the Popular Protection Units expanded their control all along the Turkish border in the direction of the Euphrates River, in the direction of the very eastern boundaries of the country. Islamic State pushed back against the Kurds. In June of 2015, Islamic State fought a sharp battle against the Kurds at the town of Ain Issa, And at Ain Issa, Islamic State was pushed back by the Popular Protection Units, fighting alongside a group of Free Syrian Army forces called the Army of Revolutionaries. And the Army of Revolutionaries, fighting together with Kurdish forces, pushed Islamic State away from Ain Issa. These battlefield successes have enabled the Kurds to set up an administration in this part of the country, an administration that has local elections, an administration that is governing this part of the country largely independently from the central government in Damascus. And this growing Kurdish influence in the northeast has generated antagonism from local Sunni population in the northeast, who have organized a militia to fight for Sunni interests that takes the name the Nuruddin Azangi battalions. The fourth theater of the current civil war is located in the far south of the country, along the border with Lebanon and along the border with Jordan. In this part of the country is where the civil war first broke out, with protests around the provincial capital of Deraa. And this part of the country is the first place that the government used force against the protesters. But after that initial use of force, this southern theater of the battle has largely disappeared from the news. It's hard to hear what's going on in this part of the country, hard to make out the dynamics taking place down in the south. What we do know is that the Assistance Front seized control of the tourist town of Busra, the important Roman ruins of the town of Busra, in March of 2015, and then the Assistance Front seized control of an important border crossing at the town of Nasib near this tourist town. So everything in green is territory that's largely under the control of the Assistance Front down in the south. The Assistance Front was able to capture so much territory down in the south that the Lebanese Islamist movement, Hezbollah, intervened in the fighting in the south. And Hezbollah has sent fighters into Syria, first of all to fight against the Assistance Front, but secondly to fight against the Free Syrian Army as well in this district of the country. After the Assistance Front intervened in the fighting, the Islamic State got involved in the southern theater as well. And you notice that not only does the Assistance Front control territory in the south, but Islamic State now has a part of the southern theater that is under its control as well. And when the Islamic State moved into the south, we see that the country's Druze community, based around Suwaida, is now surrounded by Islamic State on one side and the Assistance Front on the other side. The Druze community, therefore, has mobilized to protect itself. In the first 2 years of the Civil War, the Druze community stayed quiet. The Druze community tried to avoid getting dragged into the fighting, but now the Druze community has set up armed formations to protect itself. The Druze community is actively engaged in the Syrian civil war. It's a crucial question whether the Druze community is fighting with the opposition or fighting with the government. Most people in the opposition claim that the Druze are fighting with the government and are not part of the opposition. But the Druze community claims that it's looking out for its own interest. The Druze community claims that it's not really attached to either side in the current fighting in the civil war. It was under all of these circumstances then that Russia sent military advisors into Syria just about a year ago, at the end of September of 2015. Russian military intervention in Syria sparked an immediate reaction from Islamist militias up in the northwest. Up in the northwest, Islamist militias immediately started shooting at the Russian troops, immediately started attacking the base where the Russian forces were based. A cadre of a group called the Islamic Army shot missiles at the airfield where Russian warplanes were staging their operations. And about the same time, a breakaway group of the Army of Conquest moved in the direction of Latakia. And Islamist forces have seized the initiative in the last year in the northwest. Islamist forces are moving into villages that are populated by Alawis, moving into villages populated by Christians, pushing in the direction of the regime-held districts in the northwest. These forces are joined by fighters who have come to Syria from the former Soviet Union. And it's in the northwest where there are powerful groups of fighters from Chechnya, from Dagestan, and from other republics of the Caucasus. These fighters have come to join the fight against Russian forces and to join the fight against forces that are oppressing Muslims around the world. One of the groups of former Soviet fighters that's active in the northwest is called the Soldiers of the Caucasus. And the Soldiers of the Caucasus is largely made up of fighters from Dagestan and Chechnya. Another group that's active in the northwest is this breakaway faction of the Army of Conquest called the Utmost Army, the Jund al-Aqsa. The Jund al-Aqsa has also taken the initiative in this part of the country, is pushing into Alawi territory, pushing into Christian territory in this part of Syria. The Russian aircraft carried out their first strikes in this part of the country just about a year ago, and at first the Russian aircraft struck territory in Hama province and in Homs province and did not strike against the Islamic State, which made the United States angry, which made other Western powers angry that thought the Russians might target the Islamic State instead of targeting, I may have pushed that twice, instead of targeting other forces in the northwest. In mid-October of last year, the Popular Protection Units announced that they were forming an alliance with a number of Free Syrian Army groups to create a large coalition in the northeast called the Democratic Forces of Syria. And one of the most important actors in the Syrian civil war today is this Democratic Forces of Syria. The Democratic Forces of Syria is partly made up of a Free Syrian Army group, the Raqqa Revolutionaries Brigade, but the Democratic Forces of Syria also has a Christian militia that is part of it, a militia made up of fighters from Syria's Assyrian Christian community, and it has tribal forces in the Democratic Forces of Syria as well, tribal groups that are active in the northeast, tribal groups that are fighting against the central government in Damascus. Finally, the Democratic Forces of Syria has as well two militias made up of Syria's Turkmen minority, Turkish-speaking community inside Syria that largely live in the northeast part of the country. So notice what a heterogeneous group the Democratic Forces of Syria are. The Democratic Forces of Syria is broadly representative, broadly has fighters from many different communities up in the northeast part of the country. At the end of December of last year, the Democratic Forces of Syria that are now based in this area in blue in the map, the Democratic Forces of Syria advanced south from the area around Tel Abyad and advanced in the direction of this dam across the Euphrates River. And at the end of last year, the Democratic Forces of Syria gained control of this dam, the October Dam, across the Euphrates River. And by gaining control of this dam, the Democratic Forces of Syria captured control of large electricity-producing facilities across northern Syria, and also now controls one of the major transportation routes across from the northern part of Syria to the eastern part of Syria. At the same time that the Democratic Forces of Syria, expanded their control across the October Dam, Syrian government forces have pushed north from Aleppo in the direction of the Islamic State and tried and encircled the northern city of Aleppo from the north almost on all sides. Syrian government troops also, in the early weeks of 2016, broke the siege of two Shi'i villages north of Aleppo and re-established the government's presence on the north side of the city of Aleppo. At this point, fighters from the Assistance Front went back into Aleppo. The Assistance Front, this radical, militant, violent Islamist movement, had not been present in Aleppo for about a year prior to this time, but the Assistance Front has now moved back into Aleppo, took up the fight against government troops beginning in January of this year. So we see that by now, the Islamic State is under pressure from almost all sides. The Islamic State is under pressure from the democratic forces of Syria in the northeast. The Islamic State is under pressure from government troops moving north of Aleppo. And the democratic forces of Syria are starting to push south from the October Dam in the direction of Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State inside Syria. It's at this point, with the Islamic State under pressure from almost all sides, that talks got underway in Geneva between government officials and opposition representatives in January and February of this year. In the talks that took place in Aleppo at the beginning of this year, the Kurds were not even invited. The Democratic Union Party was not even brought to Geneva for these talks. Probably the Kurds were not invited to these negotiations out of pressure from the Turkish authorities. You can see already that the Turks are quite worried about the large zone of control under Kurdish militia command, and I didn't even show on this map that there's also a Kurdish zone here in the northwest part of the country around the town of Afrin as well. And the Turks are quite worried that the Kurds will establish control all across the northern zone of Syria, right along the Turkish border. As part of the negotiations that took place in Geneva in January and February of this year, a ceasefire was declared all across the country. And there were high hopes that perhaps during this ceasefire, some major rearrangements could be made, some major efforts could be made to bring the fighting to an end. But in the ceasefire that was declared in February, the militant Islamist movements were not included in the ceasefire. The United States, Russia, and the Syrian government explicitly reserved the right to attack militant Islamist movements and left them outside the ceasefire. So even though all of the other fighting was supposed to come to an end, Russian aircraft continued to strike at militant Islamist positions. United States aircraft continued to bomb militant Islamist positions as well. And in response, the Islamic State retaliated against Russian forces, and the Islamic State retaliated against Kurdish forces along this battle line as well. So the ceasefire quickly fell apart, and it largely fell apart because the ceasefire did not include all of the forces fighting in Syria today. In March, relatively unreported, a group of Free Syrian Army forces took control of this little dusty border town in the middle of nowhere, the border crossing at Atenf, and so the Free Syrian Army now has control of this little zone on a secondary road linking Syria to Jordan and linking Syria to Iraq. At the end of May of this year, the democratic forces of Syria started in the direction of the next dam down the Euphrates River, the large dam at Tabqa. And as the democratic forces of Syria marched down the Euphrates River in the direction of the Tabqa Dam, a second group of Democratic Forces of Syria, a second group of the Democratic Forces of Syria pushed west in the direction of the town of Manbij. And as the Kurdish forces pushed west, as the Kurdish forces pushed across the Euphrates River in the direction of the town of Manbij, the Islamic State pulled its forces out of the area north of Aleppo, and Islamic State reconsolidated its troops along the Euphrates River, reconsolidated its positions at Al-Bab. And by bringing its fighters out of Aleppo, Islamic State was able to secure its positions along the Euphrates River, was able to secure its positions in the face of this Kurdish advance. By July of this year, 3 months ago, the fighting escalated sharply around Aleppo. And of course now all that we hear about is the fighting in Aleppo. In Aleppo, beginning in the summer of this year, government troops finally cut off the last road leading into Aleppo. Government troops have finally surrounded the city and now blockaded any supplies and food headed into the city of Aleppo. This made the assistance front's tactical position very difficult, and in the face of its declining tactical position, the assistance front tried to negotiate with other Islamist movements to merge together in a unified Islamist organization. The assistance front in particular tried to merge together with the Battalions of the Free, this powerful group that we saw is operating in the northwest. The other groups replied that if the assistance front wanted to merge with them, the assistance front would have to cut its connections with Al-Qaeda. And in return for this merger, the assistance front agreed to give up its formal connections to Al-Qaeda, and the assistance front has now changed its name to the Conquest of the Levant Front. The Conquest of the Levant Front is now the militant organization that is now focused on Syria, now claims not to operate in the global fight against the West. The assistance front then, under its new name, the Conquest of the Levant Front, has redoubled its efforts to break the siege of Aleppo. And we see this horrible fighting in Aleppo now, the brutal fighting that's taking place now as the Conquest of the Levant Front joins together with a group of foreign fighters called the Turkestan Islamic Army and the Army of the Sunnah. These are fighters who have come from outside the country, quite ideological fighters, quite violent combatants. Many of the fighters who have come from the Turkestan Islamic Party, as you can tell from the name, have come from the former Soviet Union, and there seem to even be Chinese Muslim fighters as part of the Turkestan Islamic Army. There are reports that fighters from Xinjiang have also arrived in Syria to cooperate in the struggle for Aleppo. Democratic forces of Syria finally took control of Manbij in late August of this year. And as soon as the Kurdish Democratic Forces of Syria seized control of Manbij, the Democratic Forces of Syria set up a local administration over Syria. And this strikes me as an important turning point, because prior to this time, the Democratic Forces of Syria administered the country to the east of the Euphrates River, in the part of Syria that was largely Kurdish anyway, but now the Democratic Forces of Syria are actively administering a part of Syria that we might call an Arab part of Syria that has a predominantly Arab population based around the town of Manbij. And the Democratic Forces of Syria immediately announced that now that they had control of Manbij, those forces were going to push in the direction of Al-Bab and push in the direction of Azaz as well. As soon as it became clear that the Democratic Forces of Syria intended to push west from Manbij, there were reports that the Turkish armed forces were mobilizing and that the Turkish armed forces were putting together a coalition of Free Syrian Army units to push the Islamic State out of Jarablus, the last border town that the Islamic State actually occupied. And at the end of August of this year, the Turkish armed forces worked together with a Turkmen formation of the Free Syrian Army called the Sultan Murat Division, and also with other elements of the Free Syrian Army, like the Levant Corps, to overrun the town of Jarablus and seize control of territory before the Kurdish forces could move north from Manbij. These Turkish-backed armed forces then pushed south in the direction of Manbij and ended up clashing with Kurdish militias just outside Manbij. We have a new development in the Syrian civil war with this conflict taking place, this battle that is taking place between Turkish-backed forces and Kurdish, primarily Kurdish forces along the Euphrates River. The Turkish government has demanded that the democratic forces of Syria give up all of the territory west of the Euphrates River. The Turks have demanded that the Kurds pull out of predominantly Arab territory, and the Kurds have dragged their feet. The Kurds have not said no, but the Kurds have not taken any step to this point to pull out of the area west of the Euphrates River. In early September then, the United States and Russia implemented a second ceasefire. And this ceasefire had just about the same terms as the ceasefire in February. Just as in February, the ceasefire that was proclaimed in September left out the Islamist forces. Russia and the United States did not promise to stop the fighting against the militant Islamists. And so even though the ceasefire was in place, United States aircraft continued to bomb Islamic State areas outside Deir ez-Zor, and Russian aircraft continued to bomb militant Islamist positions around Aleppo. More important, Syrian government forces followed the same procedure during the recent ceasefire. Syrian government forces also attacked what they called militant Islamist positions outside Damascus. So by the end of September of this year, what we see is, in these 4 different zones of the Syrian civil war, we see that up in the northwest, the Army of Conquest continues to control large parts of Idlib province. The Army of Conquest continues to control the area around Idlib itself, and also the towns of Ariha and Jisr al-Shagur as well. The Army of Conquest has surrounded 2 predominantly Shi'i towns in this part of the country, and the Army of Conquest is holding those 2 Shi'i towns hostage because government forces have surrounded 2 Sunni towns down around Damascus, and there's an informal agreement that the government will not destroy the 2 Sunni towns in the south if the Army of Conquest promises not to destroy the 2 Shi'i towns up in the northwest. Pardon me, I'm a little bit ahead of my map. And I don't know why. Let's see if this is moving. Please excuse me. Yeah, it was moving. Oh, I see this arrow. Sorry. Technology is not the panacea that people think it should be. However, studying philosophy is a very good idea. So in the northwest, the Army of Conquest continues to control this important zone, and even though there is fighting in the northwest, the fighting has not pushed the conquest of the Levant front out of that part of Syria. In the theater around Aleppo, government troops have now been joined by Hezbollah and have been joined by Iranian fighters from the Islamic Republican Guards Corps to encircle the eastern part of the city. And as we know from reading the newspaper, an intense fight is taking place around Aleppo. Around Aleppo, the battle has 4 different sides to it. There's a 4-way struggle for the city of Aleppo right at the moment. On the one hand, government forces are fighting against the militant Islamists. And around Aleppo, government forces are fighting the conquest of the Levant Front, are fighting against the Turkestan Islamic Party, fighting against these militant Islamists. The second struggle going on around Aleppo is between government armed forces and the Free Syrian Army, because government forces are also fighting against the Northern Storm Brigade and also fighting against the Nuruddin Azangi battalions as well, in a very different kind of struggle involving very different kinds of military forces. At the same time around Aleppo, third, the Popular Protection Units that are predominantly Kurdish are fighting against militant Islamists on the north side of the city. And the militant Islamist conquest of the Levant Front and various Turkmen militias have encircled a Kurdish suburb north of Aleppo, and the Kurds are fighting to keep the Islamists from overrunning the Kurdish areas of Aleppo. Fourth, then, as if things were not complicated enough, fourth, the Turkish armed forces is now close to the area around Aleppo, and the Turkish armed forces are now actively fighting against the Kurds, are now actively clashing with units of the democratic forces of Syria. The Turkish armed forces have expelled the Islamic State and expelled other opposition forces from this area along the border, and the Turkish government now claims that it wants to set up a free zone, wants to set up a safe zone inside Syria to keep the fighting from coming near Turkish territory. Up in the northeast, the democratic forces of Syria occupy a dominant position. The one part of the country that's relatively stable, the one part of the country where the fighting is not so intense at the moment, is the northeastern part of the country, the area where the democratic forces of Syria command the territory. Up here in the northeast, under the control of the Democratic Unity Party, the Kurdish administration is carrying out a remarkable experiment in local governance. Those of you who are looking for a master's degree topic, I would urge you to take a look at this remarkable experiment in local governance that the Popular Unity Party is running up in the northeast. The Kurds have set up a collection of autonomous local administrations. The administrations are run by popular election. The reports are that for every office in the local administration, there needs to be one male and one female in each administrative office. The whole organization seems to be run according to the principles of democratic anarchism, and the commitment to gender equality up here in the northeast part of the country is really quite remarkable. You may have even seen that the Kurds have even organized a women's militia, the Women's Protection Units, that are fighting right alongside the Popular Protection Units against the Islamist militants. All of the news out of the Northeast is not particularly rosy. There are reports that in some areas up here in the Northeast, missed it already, if you blink, you miss it. Up in the Northeast, there are reports that in some villages, Kurdish fighters have pushed out Christians and have pushed out Arabs and are trying to create a homogeneous society up in the Northeast. The Kurds vehemently deny that this is happening, but it could be that there is a dark side to what's taking place up in the Northeast as well. And up in the northeast, there are occasional bombings and occasional attacks undertaken by the Islamic State. But for the most part, Kurdish forces have kept the northeast relatively quiet. In the south, where we are now, the alliance led by the conquest of the Levant front has come into direct opposition against an alliance commanded by the Islamic State. So what we see in the south is two groups of militant Islamists confronting each other, two alliances of Islamist groups confronting each other head to head, with the Druze community stuck in the middle, with the Druze community trying to defend itself from both sides. In the very most recent reports down in the south, there are reports that Islamic State is beginning to be active over here along the Lebanese border, and along the Lebanese border, Islamic State may be cooperating with the conquest of the Levant front. So it could be that the two Islamists are not completely opposed to each other in the south. They may be collaborating with each other a little bit. And as the Islamists move in the direction of the Lebanese border, they have also moved in the direction of the Golan as well. And fighting has begun to take place along the border with the Golan. And as fighting takes place along the Golan border, shells and mortar fire occasionally lands on Israeli-controlled territory down in the south. And one of the crucial things that might change in the Syrian civil war very soon now is that perhaps the Israelis will finally get involved in the Syrian civil war if fighting actually begins to take shape along the border with the Golan in the south. So under what circumstances might the civil war in Syria come to a close? Well, you will see during the course of your study that there's current research in political science about the circumstances under which civil wars come to an end. And there are at least three important theories that have been advanced in political science for why civil wars come to an end. The first theory about why civil wars come to an end claims that the fighting in civil wars finally comes to a close whenever a stalemate takes shape, and a stalemate in which both sides are punishing each other equally. The phrase is a mutually a mutually harmful, thank you, Professor Lagrenzi, you're lucky to have such a thoughtful, a mutually harmful stalemate seems to be a circumstance under which civil wars come to an end. It's generally assumed that unless the stalemate is mutually damaging, that the side that is not being punished so much will continue to fight. And so the punishment has to be equal on both sides. The two parties will not sit down at the negotiating table unless there is an equal amount of damage taking place. We might well be seeing in Syria today a situation in which punishment is almost equal on both sides. Certainly punishment is horrible in Syria on both sides. Whether or not the punishment is equally horrible is a little harder to tell. The second important theory about why civil wars come to an end claims that civil wars tend to draw to a close whenever one side achieves victory on the battlefield. Now, you might think that's a perfectly obvious way that civil wars would come to an end, but it turns out that over the last 30 or 40 years, there's a tendency in world politics, and the tendency is for negotiations to become more and more rare, for negotiated settlements to civil wars to not happen as often as they used to. And instead, the primary way that civil wars come to an end these days is for one side to overwhelm the other. And that a civil war is, a settlement for a civil war is more likely to succeed. The settlement is more likely to sustain itself if one side emerges in victory. The third, and I think, much more interesting theory about why civil wars come to an end claims that civil wars come to an end whenever each side can be assured that the other side will live up to the terms of the bargain. And that if one side or the other cannot be sure that the other side will comply, if one side cannot be sure that the other side will live up to its promises, then the settlement will collapse. Political scientists call this idea a credible commitment, that if there is a credible commitment on both sides to not just make a settlement, but a credible commitment to keep the settlement, a credible commitment to follow through with the promises, then under those circumstances, civil wars might come to an end. But you see immediately how difficult it is in the case of a civil war for either side to make a credible commitment. In Syria today, of course the government might make promises, but can we trust that the government will keep those promises? Of course the Islamists will make promises. Of course the democratic forces of Syria, led by the Kurds, might agree to some sort of settlement, but can we trust that the Kurds will live up to those settlements after the fighting stops? So the crucial question is whether the promises are believable, whether they are credible, whether we can trust that the promises will be kept. And the tricky part, the part that is so difficult to figure out for diplomats, is how to come up with a settlement that has commitments that are locked in. How to get commitments that the two sides will not turn their backs on after the fighting comes to an end. It seems to me that at least one way for a credible commitment to be made is to allow all of the parties in a civil war to keep some of their armaments. Sometimes we think that a civil war should come to an end if all sides agree to give up their arms, if all sides agree to stop the armed struggle. But of course, you can never predict, you can never be sure that the other side has given up all of its armaments. And if one side does give up its arms, and the other side cheats, and the other side does not, then the side that gives up its arms is at a complete disadvantage and completely vulnerable to the other side. So the one way to make a credible commitment might be to allow different parties in the Syrian civil war to keep the militias, to keep the armaments in place. That kind of agreement sounds contradictory. That kind of agreement doesn't sound very practical, but perhaps in a case of a brutal civil war like this, it might be the most constructive kind of agreement we could come up with. Thank you.
So thank you so much for this exhaustive and enlightening lecture. I do have quite a few questions as a discussant, but of course I also need to encourage all of you to ask your own questions. So I'm just going to go with an icebreaker, but then I would really like for you to pick it up. And I would also it's nice to see a sort of like a room full audience, and let me take also this occasion to say hi to all our viewers in Oxford and in other places who are now watching us. So as I said, a very exhaustive and very sort of like accurate depiction of the situation on the ground and its evolution, and also a very insightful theoretical framing and on the ends of civil war in general and in the last 30, 40 years. But so my first question would be, going to the heart of the issue, and I think what even not only students but people are interested in around the world, and going to the title of the lecture is, what is it that makes you now think that we may be nearing a sort of the beginning of the end of the civil war, because we do have this theoretical framing, we do have these different ways to end civil war, but what is it that leads you to believe that, you know, we are in the, if not the final stages, but that at least to some extent this civil war is winding down?
It's entirely possible that what it will take for the Civil War to end is for one side to prevail on the battlefield. Perhaps the only way for this Civil War to end will be for one side or the other to claim victory. And 2 years ago, we might have said that the opposition had the momentum, and the opposition was on its way to prevailing in the Civil War. After the Russian intervention a year ago, it now looks like the regime's armed forces have gained momentum. It looks like the regime is gaining ground, not only around Damascus, but also around Aleppo up in the north as well. And if we were going to predict at this moment which side had the tactical advantage on the battlefield, we might say it was the government armed forces. Now, I argue, you don't care about this, but I argued for many years that the government, the Syrian government, would never have meaningful negotiations as long as it was at a disadvantage. As long as the opposition had momentum, the Syrian government would never negotiate in good faith. Why? Because the Syrian government would never believe that the opposition would actually follow through. The government would think that as soon as the civil war came to an end, the leadership of Syria would all be taken out and executed, which is what we see happen in Libya, right? In Libya, as soon as the opposition had a powerful position, the old leadership was destroyed. And so there's no real reason for the Syrian leadership to follow the same path. And I expected that after the Russian intervention and after Russian troops provided an ability for the government to protect itself, I expected that maybe, now that the two forces, the two sides, were more equal, that perhaps the opportunity had come for negotiations to take place, and that maybe now the Syrian authorities would sit down in good faith. I have to tell you, I feel like maybe that prediction will not happen. I was quite discouraged that at the time of the last ceasefire, 1 day, 2 days before the ceasefire in September, President Bashar al-Assad said that he was going to wipe out the terrorists, that he wasn't really going to use the ceasefire as a chance for negotiation. The Syrian armed forces were instead going to push as hard as they could leading up to the ceasefire. Maybe the only hope is that the Syrian government could still target only the militant Islamists, could still target only what the Syrian government calls terrorists, and maybe that too would leave open the opportunity for later negotiations between the government and opposition forces. But it does seem to me that more so than in the past, the two sides are almost in the position of a mutually harmful stalemate, are almost in the situation where continuing the war has no strategic purpose to it. There seems to be no real reason to keep the fighting going.
Thank you so much. And like just before I open it up, a bit of a rejoinder to this. I mean, we do hope that, of course, this is the case, and we also have to remember, though, that mutually harmful stalemates can continue for a couple of years, even amongst very sophisticated opponents. If we think of the end of the Korea War in 1950, 1953, we just had about a year, at least a year, yes, where there was no strategic goal in sight, and we are talking about the United States, China, yes, so like yes, not sort of like ramshackle militias, and they were like sort of fighting along what is now the demilitarized zone. Yeah. So that is like, but of course that would be a sign of hope if that were the case, that we would enter this zone. But
and scholars have stopped this idea of a mutually harmful stalemate has lost people. Political scientists don't really follow that research program so much anymore for that reason, because it doesn't really predict outcomes. A stalemate can last in such an unpredictable way that that theory has lost a good deal of its credibility, of its shine.
And so one last point. I mean, let's say, though, I mean, let's wind back the clock to a year ago and so on and so forth. And let's say if the opposition were on the verge of victory, let's say the opposition prevails, Bashar al-Assad either flees or is killed, that to me looks like a recipe not for the end of a civil war, but for the continuation of a civil war in another guise. Because, I mean, your excellent overview of all the different opposition groups points to a situation where the opposition is so heterogeneous. We have like the Kurds in the north with gender equality, with like experiments in popular direct democracy, very progressive, so on and so forth. But at the same time, we have like Islamists of different hues, which are sometimes very conservative and that really cannot seem to be reconciled with more sort of democratic and progressive forces. So what is your view on?
And along those same lines, the scholars who have written about credible commitments as a way to understand the end of civil wars claim that it's extraordinarily difficult to get credible commitments if one side has many different actors on that side. And it's a lot easier to get a believable settlement, a trustworthy settlement, if there are just two actors. But if one side is made up of many different components, the credible commitment is almost impossible to achieve. And we do see at this moment that there's the Free Syrian Army, there's the conquest of the Levant Front, there's the Islamic State, there are the Kurdish groups, now there are Turkmen militias and perhaps also Christian militias to take account of. So the opposition has so many different parties that it sounds almost impossible for the opposition to make any promise. It's almost impossible for the opposition to claim that it could live up to any settlement that got reached. The regime side has many different actors at this moment as well. I already gave you more actors than you really wanted to hear about, but on the government side at this moment, there are also militias that are fighting on the side of the government that have come from Iraq. There are forces that have been mobilized in Iraq from the Shi'i community in Iraq that have come across the border to fight on the government side. So the government side now has Iraqi militias, Hezbollah, the Revolutionary Guards Corps from Iran, and the Syrian armed forces, plus all of the local militias, all of the groups called the Popular Defense Army. So both sides in Syria now have many different actors. There are two coalitions that are facing each other, not two sides.
Excellent. So let's open it up to the floor. I'm sure we are brimming with questions, and do not be shy, do not hesitate. Let's give some extra credit to whoever dares to ask the first question. If you can just stand up, and I can then repeat the question. Just come on, any volunteers? Go ahead. This is an excellent question, and it is a question related to would there be any change depending on the outcome of the U.S. elections in, I guess, American policy towards the conflict?
I will begin by telling you things that you know. One thing that has been true about American policy toward Syria is that the United States has tried desperately to stay out, has tried desperately not to get involved in the fighting. The U.S. has done this for a positive reason and a negative reason. I think economists call this a push and a pull. The United States has tried to stay out of Syria partly so that it does not get bogged down, so that it doesn't get dragged in to this conflict and American troops do not actually get killed fighting in Syria. The United States has also stayed out of Syria, though, because the United States thinks it learned a lesson from Libya. And what the United States thinks it learned from Libya is that the United States could stay, and Italy too, right? could stay 300 miles away and send aircraft to bomb various forces inside Libya and could help change the direction of the war inside Libya and not have to intervene directly. And the United States thinks that that succeeded in overturning Gaddafi and succeeded in helping the opposition prevail in Libya. So I think the Obama administration has in the back of its mind the idea that it could do the same thing in Syria. It could engage in aerial bombardments and not have to intervene directly. And in those two ways, the United States has stayed out of the fighting. If I understand things correctly, while she was Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton objected to both of those lines of argument. Hillary Clinton pushed for more involvement, pushed for more activism in the Middle East, and met resistance from President Obama. So I think that perhaps when President Clinton comes into office, what we will see is that the United States will have some temptation to get a little more involved, some temptation perhaps to be more directly involved than it has been in the past. And the secret is that nobody seems to want to tell the American people. The secret is that American troops are actively involved in Iraq and in Syria right now. Surely this has been reported in the Italian press, right? But it hasn't been reported in the American press. American troops are now fighting in Iraq again against the Islamic State, and American troops are beginning to fight in the northern part of Syria again, coming in behind the Turkish forces that I talked about. And there were reports a week ago, 10 days ago, about American special forces coming across the border, advising the Turkmen militia fighting up in the north. And as soon as the Free Syrian Army saw these American troops, the Free Syrian Army started throwing things at the American troops and started calling them nasty names and so on. And the American troops had to pull out. But we do see active American involvement in Syria even today, and I do fear, I guess, that President Clinton would increase the scale of that involvement. I do not know what President Trump's policy towards Syria might be.
Why do you say fear? Do you think that this may lead to an escalation? Do you think that it's like something without a clear strategic thinking about a greater involvement and so on and so forth?
I find it hard to see any way that American involvement or French involvement or even Russian involvement can push this conflict in a productive direction. I mean, I guess I feel that the real lesson to be learned about American involvement is not the lesson from Libya, but instead the lesson from Iraq. And the lesson from Iraq is that active American presence seems to disrupt normal political structures, seems to completely throw established structures into chaos, and so active American involvement tends to produce many more problems and produce much more militance and much more violence than American involvement actually helps. So it's always hard to imagine that the Syrian civil war can get worse than it is today, but I might be quite concerned that if American troops get involved actually on the ground in the fighting, that the violence would get worse.
Any other question? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Oh, should you repeat the question? So if we do have an equally punishing stalemate and some settlement does start to get negotiated, where could we look for leadership? In my opinion, one of the real heroes of the Syrian civil war, heroes that have been eclipsed, even though they are still active, has been the small group of nonviolent civil rights activists that are still based in Damascus and still pushing for constitutional change. This group called the National Coordinating Committee of the Forces for Democratic Change. And this group of political leaders has been pushing for multi-party elections, has been pushing for actually implementing the Syrian constitution from the very beginning. It's largely students and civil rights activists and lawyers that are part of this group. And I could imagine that these figures still have some prestige and still have some influence. It's hard to imagine that the Syrian government would ever sit down to negotiate with any of the militia leaders. It's hard to imagine that they would sit down to negotiate in good faith with any of the leaders of the armed opposition. But there are still these important figures, these figures that have risked being in prison, risked being taken away and disappeared all of this time, that might be able to emerge and serve as a kind of transitional leadership in Syria. As you know, from the very beginning, the opposition forces in Syria have completely rejected the idea that President al-Assad could play any part in a transitional government. Their primary demand is that President Assad and his, I don't know how many of his colleagues, but many of his colleagues have to leave office immediately, even before the transition can take place. And I've always thought that that was an unreasonable demand. I've always thought that that was asking too much, and that there should be some way to incorporate the current Syrian leadership into the transitional project. Because if President Assad must leave office or leave the country at the very beginning, then there's no incentive for the regime to negotiate at all. So some transitional government that had powerful representatives of the regime, had maybe some figures from the Syrian National Council, and perhaps some figures from these civil rights activists in Damascus, might well be the group that could coordinate some kind of settlement. We may not know these people's names yet, certainly in the West. We may not be able to point these people out, but I think they do exist.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, in the northeast?
That's a good question. Yeah, will an independent or autonomous, if I get it correctly, Kurdish entity emerge in the northeast of the country? Can we speculate about that?
And might it spread to the rest of the country, you were saying? Yeah, that's extremely interesting. The short answer is we don't really know how things work in different parts of the country that are under opposition control or that have managed to stay out of the fighting. It's so difficult to be a reporter. It's so difficult to get news out. And I guess being an old man, I don't really trust what I see on YouTube. You all might be able to think you can keep track of what's going on inside the country by watching YouTube. But I think in many different parts of the country, there are now local autonomous administrations. There are small experiments in self-governance that have taken shape out of necessity. Because the central government is gone, there's no other way to have services, there's no other way to have security, and there's a whole collection of locally autonomous administrative bodies, and whether those bodies could link together is an open question. At the very beginning of the uprising, there was a network of local councils called the Local Coordinating Committees. And the local coordinating committees was the management of the uprising until the militant Islamists took over and until the fighting became intense. And I don't know how much of the local coordinating committees might be left, but if the local coordinating committees could join up somehow or could coordinate with the Kurdish administration in the northeast, maybe there could be some larger experiment in democratic governance, in local electoral politics in the country as a whole. That experiment might be hard to expand to Damascus and hard to expand to Aleppo. So it'd be hard to put to the larger cities. But in a large part of the country, maybe there is some new direction that politics could go. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks for our viewers online. Thanks above all to Professor Lawson. You do know there are like exciting PISA lectures coming up on the origins of geopolitics and others. You can find them listed on our Facebook page. But this was the opening lecture, and we are very, very grateful to Professor Lawson for coming and opening our academic year. So please join me in a big round of applause for thank you.